Good morning from cloudy, rainy Texas, the Dallas area here, and we're in the Signal Post podcast this morning. We're going to decode the signals that are shaping the future of global communication. Let's get right into it. Today, we're starting with something that's sitting just under the surface of every conversation in this industry, job transformation, model ownership, and the quiet redesign of how global communication actually works inside enterprises. And today, we're going to be talking about where the value is moving and what's changing structurally, what this means for teams, for buyers, for vendors. So let's kick off the episode with the signal segment. And the first signal we're going to be discussing is the AI-driven job transformation. Don't know whether you guys followed the news this week or at the end of last week. Block's laid off about half of its workforce, 4,000 out of the 10,000 employees. There's a lot of anxiety about replacing localization roles as such as well. The assumption is that faster and cheaper translation means less work, but that's not necessarily a very solid reasoning. And one thing that came to mind for me was an article that I had written maybe 2-3 months ago, in which I alluded to Jevons Paradox, and not sure whether you guys are aware of this, but back in during the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of anxiety about the automation of machinery that came in, and people were picketing and protesting against workers being replaced, with the assumption that all the jobs are going to be lost to the machinery. At the end of the Industrial Revolution, though, it became clear that there's actually a lot more jobs that were going to be created or had been created. And there was a lot more opportunity during the Industrial Revolution than there was before. And although the jobs changed, people actually got a lot more opportunity to do different work. How do you see that working out in the current AI environment? Do you guys have an opinion about that?
Well, there's a real anxiety around roles being eliminated and disappearing, and it's a legitimate concern. But it's also important to recognize that this shift is not unique to localization. We're seeing it across various industries. Now, while the attention and the perception is around 50 or 60% of localization roles being eliminated, to your point, Stefan, there's an equal counterpoint that maybe 50 or 60% of new roles in this new economy do not exist today yet. So rather than entering this new economy or this future unknown with a handful of reactive statement, if you will, I think it's important to observe and look at the trends and focus on the opportunities, but also do not dismiss the disruption. The dust have not settled yet, right? We're still exploring, and things will continue to evolve, and we should be focused on opportunity as much as we're focused on the disruption. That's my take on it.
I like that. I think it's a very balanced take on it, and that's unusual and refreshing in our industry, because I think it's often either very dystopic or utopic. It's either there will be so much content created by AI that everyone will be fine, or it's everything will be automated and the industry will die, which has literally been statements at conferences over the last couple of years. So when we consider the signal room, we consider sort of new signals, but I think it makes sense to look back a little bit as well and try to learn from that. So one thing that comes to mind for me is another industry, travel, and what technological change meant for them. This is going back maybe 15, 20 years, where in the past, booking travel would be through agencies. You would call someone, that's maybe more than 15 years ago, and get help booking flights and so on. But that has obviously largely disappeared now and been replaced with platforms instead. if I look at recent issues that I've had traveling, and we've had a lot, I travel a bit too much, I would say. I always run into problems when I need to rebook flights, when there are delays or cancellations. It would actually be nice to work with a person sometimes to fix those issues. There were a lot of issues earlier this year when we had the polar vortex in the US, and it was impossible to get an update on what was going on with flights and so on. But anyway, so on the actual point, I guess the takeaway is that the more general bulk operations in our space, just like in the travel space, probably will be replaced. And I think platforms will grow, but roles will change, and it won't go away completely, as some of the more dystopic takes would claim.
Vince, do you have any ideas of where the future roles are going to land?
Well, I kind of agree with that. I think Wada'a's point that the dust is settling is very valid. I also kind of think it's fair to reflect that within the localization industry, we've seen upheavals like this before. I mean, it's not so long ago that TMs were invented. It's not so long ago that CAT tools became the prevalent way of working. It's not so long ago that MT kind of started to poke its head up, then neural MT. And I think all of those created a doomsday scenario in different ways. And really what it proved was that the roles evolved. I think we are in a position or in a situation where there's a lot of churn, a lot of evolution going on at the moment. But new opportunities will arise in the same way as 20 years ago there wasn't a software localization business, and how many people have had a career out of that for including myself over a number of years. I think the thing to look at is to where the roles are going. What is it? The way I tend to look at it is what we used to consider as a translator is really a language expert, is a localization expert, brings the cultural knowledge to it, and I think that's becoming increasingly important. I actually think that the role of the translator is going to become more creative. It's kind of harking back to a previous day where they were actually crafting messages. And I think if we look at global communication, that's going to become the role much more significantly. I think there will be more translation or more localization tasks required. And I think that probably language experts will move closer to being copywriters or copy editors, and really work closer with clients to craft a message, which for some translators or ex-translators, I think that'll be much more satisfying than, post-editing machine translation elements. So I do think it's an interesting time. I don't have a sense of doom around it, but I do have a sense that there's strong evolution, and it is sensible to look at what's going on as a time of change, maybe a time for some retraining, but also maybe as an opportunity to kind of rediscover some of the beauty of translation and some of the beauty of language usage and communication that maybe we've lost through over automation in the past. So I think it's a positive thing in some ways, but it's just as Wada'a said, the dust isn't settled yet. We're not sure where to go yet.
I really see that there's a technical parallel with what happened during the Industrial Revolution, in the sense that the technical capabilities that we're coming up with all of a sudden is changing the translation capabilities. I'll give you one example. It would have been unthinkable 10 years ago to be able to access a user interface for somebody that's working on a software on a software application and translating text strings. For the past 20 years, we've been struggling with that problem, and all of a sudden it's going away because we can now provide solutions in which the translators can actually have access to the layouts and get a lot of auxiliary information that was a lot more difficult to deliver to them in the past. So I think the work is getting not just more creative, but it's getting more interesting because you can do a better job at consulting and making sure that the end product is a localized product, not just a translated product. I wanted to switch the second cycle up a little bit for you guys. I don't know whether you saw the podcast last week with Renato and Florian from Slater. They were having a livid discussion on the size of the market, so I thought that would be a good topic for us to quickly discuss. Renato feels that the market is bigger if you didn't see the show, and He assumed somewhere around the 70 billion mark. Florian looks at it a little bit differently. He measures around 40 billion. Renato counts the full economic footprint and all language-related economic activity. Florian's position is a little bit more measured and just focused on the addressable markets. He counts only what is addressable and capturable by language service providers and language tech platforms. How do you guys see it? Do you have an opinion about this?
I think it's an interesting signal in that the span between the low number and the high number is so vast. I think it's a signal that the market is changing and getting redefined. So that in itself is interesting. But I think it was when I did listen to the webinar, and I think it was definitely very interesting. I think it was a great idea to bring Florian and Renato together to go into more detail on this. There was a question or a comment, I think, in the chat during the session about why are we even doing this? Why are we looking at these numbers and do these lists matter at all? And honestly, I find them fascinating. I think numbers help us understand the world. And I've been looking at these lists for the last 25 plus years, something like that, from through different lenses throughout my career in this space. Starting as a freelance translator in college, I kind of just stumbled upon, I think it was Common Sense Advisory at the time that published the list. And then setting up a single language vendor, it was really useful to look at these lists to try to understand. So these are my prime targets. These are the companies that I should work with in order to grow the business, because it was mostly serving other MLVs at the time. And then later as running essentially a localization branch of a larger organization or an MLV of sorts, looking at the list to see how do we compare, who's growing, who's degrowing, and why, try to figure that out. So really a useful point of reference. And even today from an M&A lens, so when we're looking at potential inorganic growth, who might we get strategic value from looking at the list? Because it's not just the numbers themselves, the revenue numbers, it's also the additional data that both Slater and MC publish with these lists on different market segments and so on. So I think to me that these lists are great, and the session was quite interesting. So I'm definitely going to keep my eyes peeled for when the numbers are published for 2025.
Are you Camp Renato or Camp Florian? And why?
So we've actually put a lot of research into this ourselves, looking at sort of market strategies and the TAM, the total addressable market, and so on. I think maybe Renato's number is even low when I look at the potential scope for scientific. So beyond just the core language space, global experience is in a wider sense of the world, and then word, and then beyond that, anything that we do around language, market, localization for AI, then opens up that number probably even more.
I was going to second that. Go ahead, Vincent.
I actually thought they were both correct, which was kind of interesting. I think that they were both measuring slightly different things. One thing that was interesting to me is I find that it can be quite a narrow yardstick. I think that it's a number we're putting on it, but something I came across quite recently, which I thought was, well, first of all, I think we need to look at overall what the impact of localization is. It's not just how many dollars one company spends or another dollar, but how does that impact the overall global economy, for example? And you can't put a value on what electricity is or what water is. It's just so prevalent as part of everything. And I think localization skills are becoming more and more central to economies. I think, I saw a very interesting thing this week in the EU alone. From an EU report, the 360 billion of intercountry trade was facilitated and optimized because of the availability of localization. And the EU actually expects that to grow quite massively. So when you look at it, is it 360 billion could be a figure that we put on this. I think the actual probably transfer of cash from a client to an LSP, if you're looking at those kind of figures, that will shrink. But I don't think that that's an impact or an indicator that the business itself is shrinking. I think that's a kind of an indication that it's becoming more prevalent across the wider global economy, and probably I expect that with, regulation, with all of the stuff that's happening around needing to be compliant to compliance, etc., and then hyper-personalization, that actually the value of it is different to just the dollar value between clients and LSPs, for example.
Wada, what's your take?
I was looking forward to this podcast because the gap between estimates looked like more a full-blown real-life crisis. But, I was suspected that it came down to what they were measuring, what each one was measuring. Was it workflow services, technology? And it turned out to be all of the above. But does the industry size reflects its health and where it's going or the road ahead? So that is the big question. Because now with the right tools, some companies, whether it's marketing or content management system companies, are able to develop content, net new content in target language in real life. So the categories boundaries are shifting, if you will. So this net new content still falls under the localization ecosystem, although it doesn't fit the traditional localization workflow. So how do we define that? So the real question is, how is the value moving? What are buyers willing to pay for in terms of outcomes? And how do we define the industry now that categories are actually blending? So I tend to agree with Jonas that if we look at all of these factors combined, in the next few years, we might exceed 80 billion.
I think it's a good framing and it's actually an opportunity as well, when we're going back to the first signal of the dystopia of the sort of core narrative over the last couple of years. So is the industry dead? This is a huge opportunity for all LSPs to actually go and change a little bit, redefine what they do, and go after that market. It's a big topic. I think it's probably a topic that we should talk about at length in a future episode of this. But I'm excited about that. I do think that the number might grow quite a bit in the future.
I thought these two signals really had great symbiosis because the anxiety about losing jobs ties in with the opportunity that you're just talking about. And one of the challenges of measuring the market properly is really evaluating it in its entirety. And there's so much opportunity that kind of bridges over to other areas that I think we're going to have trouble or we're going to have to figure out what we're going to call ourselves in the next 5 years. And localization is probably not going to be the right word. I was interviewing Jose Palomares just a couple of days ago, and he's talking about global experience. We've had people advocate for language operations and things like that. There's a lot of opportunity outside of the strict boundaries of localization. And so when you're measuring the markets, what are you really measuring? And that was probably the biggest part of the discussion that Florian and Renato had as well. Listen, guys, I think we should jump into the primary theme of our episode a little bit and talk about organizational restructuring around AI in the industry, if you're okay. Maybe let's kick it off with a question for Wada right away on internal reorganization. Wada, are we watching localization dissolve or are we watching it integrate? That ties in perfectly with what I just said, so go ahead.
Well, I tend to have a different angle on this. I think we're entering what I like to call a phase 3 type of restructuring. So phase 1 was AI. It took the industries at scale, and a lot of layoffs and roles were eliminated without a proper assessment. And then the human in the loop model emerged, and that brought a level of clarity between, okay, what type of tasks and workflows and services we can automate versus the areas where we still need the human engagement, we still need the human judgment. And now we're at a point where we're focusing on upskilling. There's a level of clarity that I'm encountering, at least with my clients, when we work on reorganization structure or emerging roles, if you will. So there's an appetite for new roles, such as AI governance role, AI revenue predictability role. And when you define the work and the role needed to fulfill the work, then you have clarity on what type of upskilling you need. So we are at this point now in terms of, okay, we have a couple of new roles that seem to be evergreen and steady for the next wave of AI. They're going to be needed because governance and security are front and center. We also need to put a number on the AI revenue. So predictability is key. And with the right tools, you are able to get these results. But the dust has not settled. And again, it's all going to boil down to how workflows are evolving, the governance and the security needs continue to rise, and how clients define the role of AI across the organization, not just in localization. So restructuring is happening, roles are emerging, but there's also a level of clarity that we did not have in the past. And that's what's actually promising at this point.
Jonas, what kind of roles do you see emerging on the buyer side currently?
So I'd say there are major shifts in motion right now, both on the vendor and the buyer side. It's a bit different depending on the nature of the company. So we work with some companies that might be considered maybe conservative, or they have a long-term vision, depending if you take the positive or the somewhat negative slant on it, where we don't see a lot of change in the roles yet. So for those organizations, they might rely more on their vendor to help them with the change. We've seen, like, going back to fairly soon after ChatGPT was released, whatever it is, 3-4 years ago at this point, companies starting to ask for pilots or POCs. How can we use this tool? And that's transformed quickly after that into production-ready deployments in some cases, and in others we're still sort of at the pilot stage, depending on how fast these companies move. And other organizations, I think, are forced to change rapidly. So there's job displacement. We've seen that, unfortunately, quite a lot over the last 6 to 12 months, maybe even longer, that localization departments are downsizing. So these organizations are then quicker to embrace the new ways of working because they're essentially forced to do that. The expectations aren't lower. They still are expected to release global products and content. So they have to figure out other ways of doing that. So the roles on the buyer side is getting more technical because of that. So they have to figure out how to use AI. So we've seen AI experts being hired, or people are training to become AI experts, and the pressure is on for the vendor side to be able to keep up with that. One signal that I think is interesting that we've seen over the last just a couple of months is around fine-tuning. I think this is becoming already a strong signal, but I think it's going to get stronger and stronger in the next couple of months. Fine-tuning has been a topic for a long time, way before ChatGPT and fine-tuning and training AI. But recently, the conversation has shifted to, do we actually need to fine-tune or not? And again, a big topic, a big signal I think that we'll see more of in the future. But the reason I'm mentioning that here is that I think that's an indication of how the roles are changing on the buyer side, because it's on the buyer side that they are actually challenging that. Should we fine-tune or not? Meaning that they are actually becoming more AI experts, those types of roles, increasingly. So I think that's been a very interesting change over the last month or so, that it came very quickly as a new conversation.
Yeah, Vincent, what does it mean for the structural ownership of localization? Is localization moving from a bolt-on function to a core operational layer, or how do you see that?
I think it's interesting. I think first, Wada'a's point on the human in the loop, I think we're moving to humans above the loop now. I think that, rather than being in as an active member of the workflow, that becomes more automated, but it needs more governance. And I think that the human looking down on the loop is becoming increasingly important. I do think that typical translation department that would have existed in enterprise is evolving. I think those skills that once were standalone, that were bolted onto the end of the process to get, localized versions of software, for example, is changing. I saw something from the Think Left organization, for example, where now in the past where we would have software and then to be the English version, then we'd somehow try and modify it for the Japanese market. That's baked into the development cycle now. So we actually are implementing those rules as part of the life cycle. We're catching bugs much earlier. It's much more efficient to be dealing with those sort of challenges as part of the life cycle of product development, I think. And I think that's similar with marketing. You're starting to see that the marketing product owners and the marketing team will have, I consider it global communication experts, but they will have what would be members of the standalone localization team embedded into those core teams. And I do think Jonas has a point around the fine-tuning or not. I think, I was a great proponent of fine-tuning 2 years ago. It was the only way to really emulate the type of quality we were able to get from TMs. But I kind of see it now, the opportunity or the requirement of that is a little bit antiquated. I think that the driving for, we need to do full fine-tuning is trying to think of the LLM replacing the TM. And I think that with the improvement in context windows, the improvement in more focus models and workflows that are using multiple models in different phases of the workflow gives us the opportunity to be much more targeted in the information we're given to at individual task level. In the past, you fine-tune your model and then that becomes your TM. You hope that the model is going to give you the quality output that you want based on the full corpus of what you've given it. Whereas now, more modern workflows, you give it a component of your previous translations that really are focused on the task at hand, and that the ability for the LLMs to parse that content and give higher outputs and higher quality is actually improving. So my own attitude towards this has evolved over the last couple of years. I kind of see it's the next stage in the depth of the segment and the growth of full document translation, for example, full context.
I have a thought-provocative follow-up question for you that I wanted to quickly pitch your way. I've had several conversations over the last months with people like Sebastian Ciesielski that indicate that translation memories are actually kind of getting in the way at this point. We were thinking about them in a RAG capacity, but are they maybe really on the way out? And are we not going to use any translation memories in the future, you think?
That's a hard one. That's something that you've invested in 10 years, 15 years and maintain your quality. It's the benchmark of your quality. It's the benchmark of your methodology. And it still is the quality benchmark. Do I think ultimately TMs will go? Yeah, probably, but I don't think it's yet. And I think the role of TMs will become stronger in general knowledge rather than specific, here's this segment matched to that segment. I think that I think quality will be the last thing to go, because you want to be sure what hits your customer is going to be the highest possible quality. And I think at the end of the chain that matters. And at the moment, the best place to identify where your quality benchmarks are in TM. So it's still gold. The way they're utilized will change, I think.
So the angle that I heard was it's not necessarily about quality from a TM point of view, but about customization. The more people are getting used to customization and to be able to twist the text to their complete liking or to a very specific audience on the fly, the more challenging it becomes to work with translation memories that are super rigid, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's no longer going to be a single source of truth. documents are going to be generated by brief. The same way as AI, the AI business operates at the moment, there will be hyper-personalization. So the English document will be a representation of what they want, of what the German document will be. But ultimately, there may be 5 German documents, depending. There could be 1,000 German documents, depending on who the end user is going to be. So the idea that it's a single source of truth will go away, but the idea that it's a bastion of quality will remain.
I think there's another way to look at that single source of truth aspect of it, where the single source of truth becomes the LLM that is trained over time by any content that a company puts out in the world, which really, again, expands the importance of this industry, because we will essentially define what the future brand perception is in the world. And that is the single source of truth for those organizations.
Now, to second Vince's point around the value of translation memory, I think it would still have value in a manufacturing space and environment because it's highly regulated. And the type of work in terms, if you look, for example, for owner's manuals and service manuals for motorcycling or cars or large engines, it's a paint by number type of a deal. Every project is cloned the way it is every single year, unless you have a new model, which needs to be rewritten from scratch. And then you change or you update the disclaimers. So when you have a strong and solid TMs, you actually reduce the amount of prompting. Why do you want to reinvent the wheel and have a prompt engineer come up with updates for something quite stable and quite solid from a TM perspective across 156 markets? So I still see the value of translation memories for the years to come in a highly technical structural manufacturing environment.
Let's talk a little bit about the commercial model evolution. If localization is integrating into product and AI workflows, then the commercial model has to change too. And in particular, the big discussion that's been raging is what pricing model we should imply, whether the per word model is finally out the door. I think Wada'a has strong opinions about that. Isn't that so, Wada'a?
I do, but again, I think as humans, we're very bad at predicting the future. But if we look at the role of LSPs, how it evolved significantly when AI took the industries by scale, they moved from heavy lifters to gatekeepers. And I experienced this firsthand during my time at Zendesk back in 2020, when AI, completely changed the landscape and the way we look at business. And we had a nice global partner strategy and network of 4 vendors who were overachievers. And the initial reaction was, okay, what do we do? A lot of functions around us were letting their vendors go or minimizing their pool of or network of vendors. Instead, we decided to shift gears and switch roles. So AI was doing the heavy lifting in terms of processing and routing content, short form content, and then our vendors became the gatekeepers. But in that same vein, vendors were under pressure to rebrand and rethink the way they structure their resources and the way they package their services, because AI redefined the way we looked at scale. So the per word rate structure and the standard economies of scale is less relevant now. When we look at scale now, we're looking at governance, brand integrity, consistency, time to market. So vendors are under pressure to repackage and differentiate themselves in a highly evolving environment. Now, what does this mean? It means that LSPs are not just redefining the services or the technology, but they're facing challenges from various angles. They have to stay up to speed with AI innovation. They have to upskill their team members so they can continue to come across as thought leaders when they work with their clients. Some of them are considering mergers and acquisitions because they simply cannot sustain this new wave of AI. And what I have seen, and I've been engaged in projects with my clients, what I like to call a V2V partnership, vendor-to-vendor partnership. I never thought that competitors would join forces to sustain this AI wave, but But when you have a strong tech company and a strong services company, they are able to join forces and separate church and state when it comes to trade secrets and conflict of interest, and be able to move forward. So the LSPs are under a lot of pressure. For now, the per word rate still exists, but it's not sustainable long term. You also want to consider, I think we're too focused on AI and technology, but we tend to forget the next generation of buyers and clients. They think differently. And if you have children, if you have teenagers, you can relate to what I'm referring to and talking about. The next generation of buyers value simplicity, and they don't have time or attention for a long RFP with a long list of per word rate per language. They want you to come and say, I'm going to provide you with a simplified approach to price your services, and it's going to be very easy for you to apply. And also, if you have teenagers and if you deal with younger generations, you know that they value subscription. They don't want to commit to a long-term per word rate. They want a subscription that gives them the flexibility to focus on their core competency on the job. So my point is, I'm not suggesting to completely rule out the per word rate, but let's stay less focused on AI, or focused enough on AI, and consider the next generation of buyers, because they're the new economy and they're the ones who are going to be driving decisions.
Jonas, are those the buyers you see in the RFPs? Do you see that kind of behavior, and are they shifting ownership and accountability towards the vendors?
Well, that has a great point. I really like the generational perspective on it. It makes a lot of sense. I honestly, I think it's going to change a lot, obviously, in the entire industry, and not just our industry, but in general, based on how the world has changed as these kids were growing up. But the other clear correlation is to, I guess, the first, maybe both the other signals that we talked about around AI getting more important, but also the job displacement. So we do see these types of changes reflected in requests for proposals and overall requirements from buyers. We do see a shift of accountability to vendors, more expectations on the vendor to run things, and that's most likely, or very probably, linked to the fact that localization teams are shrinking, but also potentially to Vincent's point about localization and translation, global communication becoming a function in other teams, that it's sort of expanding outside the usual way of doing it 5 years ago with word rates and so on, where you have buyers that aren't really familiar with the old ways to work in some cases. If we look at some of the new AI native companies that don't necessarily have a big localization department, they might have a localization manager, as we've seen in some cases over the last 6 to 12 months, that some of the model builders have hired localization managers. But I think the type of buyers are changing, and hence the RFPs are changing as well. And it's related to job displacement. I do agree with Wada'a that it's going to get quite challenging for some of the smaller vendors to keep up with that. So probably we'll see more consolidation in the industry and new types of players coming up as well. I think another change that we've seen is that buyers have much more specific use cases now. So I mentioned, like, after ChatGPT was released, it was more around pilots and POCs and so on, but it changed quickly to real production, and it sort of started with empty QE. You could use AI to support quality, but that's really table stakes now. I think there's a lot of good empty QE options out there, and that's not a differentiator at all anymore. There are newer areas, things like AIP, AI post editing, that is becoming production grade over the last 6 to 12 months, or multimodal AI. That is another big opportunity to use AI for global content and global experiences. Finally, I think the sophistication in the procurement team is increasing as well. They are more certain what to ask for, what type of use cases and savings and so on that potentially you can get from leveraging AI and new ways of working.
These kind of new workflows, they're causing quite a bit of structural pressure. Vince, do LSPs need to become AI companies to stay competitive? And are we heading towards consolidation with partnerships at tech firms that the kind of cooperations that Wada'a was talking about, you think?
I certainly think they need to be AI literate, and certainly need to have it implemented within their programs. I think one thing that's been interesting for me around this is I've been experimenting a lot with OpenClaw recently, and there's this Claw Hub, which essentially was agents communicating with each other. And one thing I noticed in that, which I thought was really interesting and probably will have an impact, is sometimes in some of the discussions, the first agent will make a comment in English. It'll be responded to in Chinese. And then the next agent will respond to that Chinese comment in English. There was no pivot. There's no change. And I think when we start to see, from language A to language B, and in the past we always had to think of English as a pivot language, I think more and more use of agent-driven workflows is going to change that there's the fluidity starting to happen there that frankly I wasn't expecting. I kind of thought, oh, well, agents will develop their own language. I mean, most of the reason that we use structured common language at the moment is because we can observe what's going on with the agents, and we can observe what's going on and provide oversight for human oversight. But ultimately, as that evolves, it's going to be much more fluid. Perhaps there will be communication channels in languages that aren't our languages at all, and it'll be only at the end, the beginning at the end, that the natural language will be used, and a lot of stuff will kind of happen under the hood. And I think that was the first real example I saw that, where it was like, oh, the language is not, what it was the language is not a barrier. It was a facilitator. All of the agents that were talking in these groups were able to communicate in their preferred way, and all of the other agents understood them. I think that language as a barrier is interesting.
That's fascinating, right? Translating agent to English or whatever, that's a language in itself in the future.
This thing that you just talked about, Vincent, makes me think of a conversation I had last year with somebody who's responsible for a big gaming company. I can't name any names because I was sworn to secrecy, but one of the things that they're working on is this omnidirectional multilingual platform in which gamers can actually talk in their own language but are received on the other end in whatever language that the other player is playing on. So you can envision somebody playing a game in China, talking in Mandarin, and interacting with somebody in France who is speaking to that person in French, and me in Texas, being in on the same game, is watching that conversation take place in English at the same time. That's kind of the direction I think it's going with technology. There's all kinds of new possibilities that have nothing to do with source and target language anymore, and have everything to do with multimodalism and omni-channels in that sense. I knew this was going to happen. We have way too much content to cover in just a short amount of time that we had carved out for this podcast. That leaves us lots to talk about for the next one. But I wanted to do a quick fire round with you guys in parting, if that's all right. It's just a quick true or false. I'm going to make some bold statements, and you can tell me whether you agree or disagree. AI will reduce the total amount of language work done globally. True or false?
Definitely false.
All right, that's comforting. Localization teams will shrink, but their strategic influence is going to grow.
True. Yeah, was that true?
False for the second part.
That's for the next episode. We're gonna let you give an explanation about that in the next one. Fine tuning will become standard practice, Vince, for enterprise multilingual AI.
It's already on the way out, so false.
Prompt engineering is enough for most enterprise use cases.
False.
No way.
The per word pricing model will largely disappear within 5 years.
True.
True.
False.
Okay, that's interesting. That's another one we're going to have to discuss further, Jonas. Governance will matter more than raw translation quality.
True.
True.
All right, good. Localization will no longer exist as a standalone department in most enterprises. Ooh, that's a bold one.
True.
True.
We're taking notes for the next episodes. That's fine. We'll have lots to talk about. The most valuable language professionals in 2026 are going to be AI native.
I'm not certain. I'm on the fence on that one.
All right. Multilingual content will increasingly be generated natively, not translated.
When, I guess, is my counter to that. Not this year. False.
You're breaking the rules of the game. It's true or false, Jonas. It's and then maybe the last one, the biggest risk for this industry is emotional overreaction rather than technological disruption.
False.
Yeah, false.
I'm on the fence on that one as well.
Well, Jonas, Wada'a, Vincent, thank you so very much for sharing all your insights in the Signal Room this morning. And I can't wait to get together with you the next time. Until then, I wish you a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. See you next time.